In 1935, the most prestigious car company in America looked at its balance sheet, panicked, and decided to sell a car for $980. The brand that built limousines for presidents and kings. The company whose slogan was, "Ask the man who owns one." They put their name on a car that cost less than a Buick. It worked. And then it killed them. This is the story of Packard. Not just how it died, but why its death was so slow, so avoidable, and so painfully self-inflicted that it reads like a Greek tragedy set in Detroit. To understand what Packard lost, you have to understand what Packard was. And what Packard was, for the first 4 decades of the 20th century, was the finest car made in America. Full stop. Germany had Mercedes-Benz. England had Rolls-Royce. The United States had Packard. They were the standard against which every other luxury car was measured, and most came up short. It started in 1898, when a mechanical engineer named James Ward Packard bought a Winton motor carriage for $1,000. Winton was supposed to be a quality machine. This one was not. The thing barely ran. Packard kept bringing it back for repairs, kept sending letters with suggestions for improvement, kept getting the runaround, until finally Alexander Winton told him something along the lines of, "If you're so smart, build a better one yourself." Most people would have walked away annoyed. James Ward Packard walked away inspired. He wrote to a potential investor named George Weiss in April of 1899. "It is a branch of work which has great fascination for me, and it is not impossible that I may go into it someday." That's the understatement of the century. He recruited his brother William, hired a couple of defectors from Winton's own engineering team, and set up shop in his electrical engineering factory in Warren, Ohio. By October of 1899, Packard had his own engine on a test stand, putting out 7.1 horsepower. A month later, the first Packard automobile emerged, 1 cylinder, 12 horsepower by the time they sorted it out. It was already better than the Winton, considerably better. The early Packards attracted attention fast. William Rockefeller bought 2 at the New York Auto Show in 1900. The cars had a quality of construction that was immediately obvious, even to people who knew nothing about engines. Everything fit, everything worked, everything lasted. The company's advertising slogan, "Ask the man who owns one," wasn't really advertising at all. It was a dare. They were so confident in the product that they let their customers do the selling. By 1903, a group of wealthy Detroit investors, led by Henry Bourne Joy, had bought into the company and moved it to Detroit. Joy had bought a Packard while visiting New York, was so impressed he visited the brothers in Ohio, and then convinced some of the richest families in Detroit to invest: Truman Newberry, Russell Alger Jr., Philip McMillan. Old railroad and mining money. Joy hired architect Albert Kahn to design a factory on 40 acres along East Grand Boulevard. Kahn's 10th building in the complex used reinforced concrete, a first for automobile manufacturing in Detroit. His brother Julius had invented a new type of steel reinforcing bar with 45-degree angled ears that prevented the concrete from fracturing under load. This allowed for wide-open factory floors with fewer support columns and massive windows for natural light. The Packard plant became a template for every major factory that followed, including Ford's Highland Park plant. When it was finished, it was considered the most modern automotive manufacturing facility in the world, with over 80 buildings eventually covering 80 acres. Packard craftsmen practiced over 80 specialized trades within its walls. Now here's the thing about early Packard. They weren't just building cars, they were inventing the car as we know it. The modern steering wheel, Packard. Before that, cars used tillers. Automotive air conditioning, Packard. The glove compartment, taillights, the limited slip differential, all Packard. They were an engineering company first and a car company second, and that distinction mattered. In 1904, Packard engineer Charles Schmidt built a lightweight aluminum racer called the Gray Wolf, 24 horsepower, 1,310 pounds. He took it to Ormond Beach, Florida, and hit 77.6 miles per hour, setting the American speed record. Then he entered the first Vanderbilt Cup race on Long Island and finished fourth against European machines with 3 times the power. Packard was putting itself on the map. And then it went and redrew the map entirely. In May of 1915, Packard introduced the Twin 6, 12 cylinders, 424 cubic inches, 88 horsepower. Now those numbers might not sound extraordinary today, but in 1915, most cars had 4 cylinders and maybe 20 horsepower. Cadillac had just introduced its V8 the previous autumn. Packard looked at that and said, essentially, "That's cute," then dropped a V12 on the market. The engine was the work of Jesse Vincent, Packard's 35-year-old chief engineer, who would hold that position until he retired in 1946. Vincent understood something fundamental about 12-cylinder engines. With 12 firing impulses per operating cycle, spaced 60 degrees apart, you got 6 power strokes per crankshaft revolution. The torque delivery was so smooth that Vincent himself described it as being like steam. He wasn't exaggerating. Here's the technical explanation for why that matters. A 6-cylinder engine is theoretically in perfect balance because the forces from one piston rising are canceled by equal and opposite forces from another piston falling. But to make that work, you need a heavy crankcase, a heavy crankshaft, and a rigid flywheel. Vincent's insight was that a 12-cylinder engine, essentially 2 sixes sharing a crankcase at a 60-degree angle, could achieve the same balance with less weight. The Twin 6 engine weighed 900 pounds. That's 400 pounds less than the 6-cylinder engine it replaced. Less weight, more power, smoother delivery. The individual cylinders had a bore of 3 inches and a stroke of 5 inches. Nothing exotic there. But multiply those dimensions by 12, and you get 424 cubic inches of displacement with a torque curve that felt like it had no steps at all. Automotive journalists of the era wrote that you could accelerate from 3 miles per hour to 70 in top gear without a single hesitation. Race driver Ralph De Palma lapped the Chicago Speedway in a stock Twin 6 touring car at 72.7 miles per hour. One owner later wrote to the company, "It has 12 cylinders, but I only need 4. The rest of them came with the engine, and just let them run. The starter starts, and the generator gens, and the battery bats, and the brakes break." The Twin 6 started at $2,600 and went up to $4,800 for the Imperial Landaulet. That's roughly $55,000 to $100,000 in today's money. Expensive. But they sold over 35,000 of them between 1915 and 1923. The engine was so good that it formed the basis for the Liberty aircraft engine that powered Allied planes in World War I. Jesse Vincent co-designed the Liberty himself and was commissioned as a colonel in the process. He stayed Colonel Vincent for the rest of his life. Through the 20s, Packard was dominant. They exported more cars than any other brand in their price class. By 1930, they were selling in 61 countries. The Imperial House of Japan owned 10 Packards. Presidents Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge rode in them. In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt gave Joseph Stalin an armored Packard 12. Stalin loved it, drove it for years. Clark Gable owned one. The car was synonymous with power, taste, and old money. Packard's gross income hit nearly $22 million in 1928. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $400 million. The company was known as one of the 3 Ps of American luxury motoring, alongside Pierce Arrow and Peerless. But here's where the story starts to turn. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. The Depression hit, and it hit hard. Not so much Packard itself, which had been conservatively managed and was sitting on roughly $20 million in assets, by 1932. But the market for hand-built luxury cars collapsed. When unemployment is over 20%, even people who can afford a $12,000 automobile don't want to be seen in one. Peerless stopped building cars in 1932. By 1938, Franklin, Marmon, Stutz, Duesenberg, and Pierce Arrow were all gone. Every single one of the three P's competitors was dead. Packard was the last man standing. And this is where the fatal decision happened. Packard had an advantage the others didn't. A single production line that kept costs low. Interchangeable parts between models. They could have ridden it out. They had the cash. But the board looked at the numbers and got nervous. Sales of the big cars were shrinking. So in 1935, Packard introduced the 120. The 120 was, by any objective measure, a fine automobile. New Packard designed aluminum head inline 8, 110 horsepower, gorgeous styling by Werner Gubitz, prices starting at $980. For context, the Packard 12 started at around $3,700. The 120 cost about a quarter of that. It was a Packard you could buy for less than a Buick. And it sold. It sold spectacularly. In its first year, Packard moved nearly 25,000 120s against just 7,000 of everything else combined. By 1936, they built over 55,000 of them. Then, in 1937, they went further. A new Packard 6 starting at just $795. That's Nash territory, Oldsmobile territory. The company that used to sell exclusively to Rockefellers was now competing for the same customers as Pontiac. Sales exploded from about 8,000 cars in 1934 to 122,000 in 1937. It was the best thing that ever happened to Packard's balance sheet, and the worst thing that ever happened to its brand. The problem was simple and devastating. The cheap Packards looked like Packards. Chief stylist Werner Gubitz had done too good a job scaling down the styling cues of the senior cars. They wore the same distinctive ox yoke grille. They carried the same name on the hood, same general proportions, same visual language. And, suddenly, the doctor's wife, pulling up to the country club in her 12-cylinder Packard, was parking next to her dentist's receptionist, who was driving a car with the same name that cost a fifth as much. The magic evaporated. The exclusivity was gone. The name that had once meant, "I have arrived," now meant, "I got a good deal." There is a quote from automotive historian Beverly Ray Kimes that captures it perfectly. Packard's sin wasn't building the 120, it was calling it a Packard. Cadillac, meanwhile, was protected. General Motors had created LaSalle as its medium-price companion brand back in the 20s. When they discontinued LaSalle in 1940, they still had Buick and Oldsmobile sitting below Cadillac in the corporate hierarchy. The Cadillac nameplate never touched anything cheap. It couldn't. The corporate structure wouldn't allow it. Packard, being an independent company with just that single production line and no parent corporation, didn't have the luxury of a companion brand. They put the Packard name on everything because it was the only name they had. Some historians argue they could have created a separate brand, called it something else, anything else. But Packard's single-line production setup made that impractical, and frankly, the people running the company in the mid-30s didn't fully appreciate what the name was worth until it was too late. Now, the engineering underneath those junior Packards was solid. The 120 used a new chassis with independent front suspension, hydraulic brakes, and that smooth inline 8. It weighed about 3,700 pounds, rode on a 120-inch wheelbase, and could hit 85 miles per hour in the 1936 version with the bigger 282 cubic inch engine. The build quality was genuinely high for the price point. These were good cars. They just shouldn't have been called Packard. Think of it this way. Imagine if Rolex started selling a watch for $200, same crown logo on the dial, available at every department store. The $300 Rolex might be an excellent watch, But the guy who spent $15,000 on a Submariner is not going to be happy. And the guy thinking about spending $15,000 is going to pause and ask himself what he's really paying for. That's exactly what happened to Packard. Then World War II arrived, and Packard did something remarkable. They converted entirely to military production and built over 55,000 Rolls-Royce Merlin V12 engines under license. These were the engines that powered the P-51 Mustang, the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the Lancaster bomber. 27 liters of displacement, 1,490 horsepower at 3,000 RPM from a bore of 5.4 inches and a stroke of 6 inches. Liquid-cooled, supercharged, and operating at tolerances that would have been considered aerospace grade. The story of how Packard got the contract is telling. Rolls-Royce needed more Merlins than British factories could produce, and U-boats in the North Atlantic made shipping finished engines from Britain unreliable. They approached American manufacturers. Henry Ford initially agreed, then backed out. The reasons are debated. What isn't debated is that Packard stepped up with a $130 million contract, equivalent to roughly $3 billion in today's money, and delivered. The first Packard-built Merlin ran in August of 1941. Full production started in '42. Packard didn't just copy the engine. They adapted it for American mass production methods while maintaining Rolls-Royce's exacting standards. The Packard V 1650, as the American military designated it, went through several variants, culminating in the V 1657 with a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that gave the P-51 Mustang its legendary high-altitude performance above 30,000 feet. Many engineers argued the Packard-built Merlins were more consistently assembled than the Rolls-Royce originals, because Packard's precision manufacturing from decades of luxury car production translated directly to aircraft engines. They also designed and built the 4 M2500 Marine V12 for PT boats, 1,500 horsepower per engine, 3 engines per boat. That included the ones powering PT-109, commanded by a young lieutenant named John Kennedy. By the time the war ended, Packard was in excellent financial shape, $33 million in assets, a proven engineering team, a factory full of workers who just spent 4 years building some of the most sophisticated engines in the world. Everything was in place for a triumphant return to civilian production. They blew it. The post-war Packards were warmed over 1942 designs. The company had only the clipper body tooling available, as the Senior Series dies had apparently been left to deteriorate. Some stories claim Roosevelt gave the Senior dies to the Soviets, and the ZIS-110 limousines that later carried Soviet leaders around Moscow do bear a suspicious resemblance to pre-war Packards. Whether that's true or just legend, the practical result was the same. Packard came back to the civilian market with an old car and no way to quickly build a new one. The media started calling them bathtubs and pregnant elephants. The styling was conservative when the market was moving toward longer, lower, flashier designs led by Harley Earl at General Motors. Cadillac's post-war cars looked like the future. Packard's looked like the past with a new paint job. Worse, Packard made a critical engineering decision. They committed significant resources to developing their Ultramatic automatic transmission instead of a modern overhead valve V8 engine. The Ultramatic was a decent transmission, but the market didn't need another transmission. It needed power. Cadillac and Oldsmobile got their overhead valve V8s in 1949. Chrysler had its Hemi by '51. Even cash-strapped Studebaker had a V8 by 1951. Packard wouldn't get its own V8 until 1955, 6 years behind Cadillac. In the car business, that's not a gap. That's a canyon. Since 1940, Packard had been farming out its body production to Briggs Manufacturing. Then, in 1952, Chrysler bought Briggs. They agreed to keep supplying Packard bodies through 1954, but after that, Packard was on its own. This forced Packard to find a new body plant in a hurry, and they settled on a cramped former Chrysler facility on Conner Avenue in Detroit. The move was a disaster. Quality plummeted. Doors didn't fit. Panels didn't align. James Nance, who'd been hired as president in 1952 from the Hot Point Appliance Company, later said one patrician sedan was so badly assembled that it literally required a crowbar to open the rear door. Nance had arrived with big plans. He wanted to separate the cheaper Clippers into their own brand and restore Packard to its rightful place at the top of the luxury market. He also wanted to merge with other independent automakers to create a fourth major car company. George Mason at Nash had the same idea. They planned to combine Nash, Hudson, Studebaker, and Packard into a single entity that could compete with the Big Three. It didn't happen. Mason died suddenly in October of 1954, 1 week after Packard purchased Studebaker. His successor at the newly formed American Motors, George Romney, wanted nothing to do with Packard or Nance, so Nance was stuck. He'd bought Studebaker thinking it was a stepping stone to a larger empire. Instead, it was a millstone. Packard's chief financial officer, Walter Grant, dug into Studebaker's books and came back, according to accounts, looking ashen. During negotiations, Studebaker had claimed its break-even point was around 165,000 cars a year. Grant's analysis put the real number at 282,000. The closest Studebaker had ever come to that was 268,000 back in 1950. Their South Bend factory workers were paid by the piece, not by the hour, which meant labor costs were substantially out of line with the rest of the industry. The factory itself was ancient, predating Packard's own Detroit plant. Nance later said that after the war, Studebaker's management wouldn't take a strike. Everybody else took strikes, and reasonable compromises were reached on wages and benefits. Studebaker didn't, and they never caught up. One industry observer called the merger two drunks helping each other across the street. It's hard to argue with that assessment. Nance was horrified. He later called the discovery a kick in the gut. But there was no going back. Packard had spent its resources on the acquisition. And to make matters worse, Eisenhower's Secretary of Defense, Charles Wilson, the former CEO of General Motors, was steering defense contracts toward GM and away from the independents. The Korean War contracts that had been keeping Packard afloat dried up. Meanwhile, Ford and GM were waging a brutal price war that hammered every independent automaker. Chrysler and Ford were also actively poaching Packard dealerships, leaving the dealer network thinner and more scattered with each passing year. The 1955 Packards were actually impressive cars. Stylist Dick Teague did a sharp facelift on the old body. A new 320 cubic inch V8 finally arrived, and the torsion-level suspension, using torsion bars front and rear with an electric leveling system, was genuinely innovative. It was the first active suspension system in a production American car. The Caribbean convertible packed an industry-leading 310 horsepower for 1956. But the quality problems from the Conner Avenue plant followed them. Dealers received cars in colors nobody ordered because flawless examples were so rare. Customers had already started walking away. In 1955, Packard and Clipper combined managed about 55,000 sales. It wasn't enough. The 1956 models were better built, with a sharp facelift and vivid paint jobs. But by then, the press had hung the troubled label on the company, and buyers were spooked. Barely 10,000 senior Packards were built for 56. Those were the last real Packards assembled in Detroit at the Conner Avenue plant. After that, it was over in everything but name. The Packards, built in South Bend from 1957 to 58, were Studebaker presidents with different trim and some extra chrome. Badge-engineered imposters that fooled exactly no one. Longtime Packard owners wouldn't touch them. New buyers saw through the disguise. The Studebaker Packard Corporation was hemorrhaging money, and by 1956, the U.S. government itself got involved, because Studebaker had been a major military supplier since the Civil War. Curtiss Wright, the aviation giant, stepped in with operating capital, effectively taking control. Nance, who'd never wanted to play second fiddle to anyone, left for Ford, where he became a vice president in the Mercury Edsel Lincoln division. Harold Churchill, the Studebaker chairman, proposed killing the Packard name. The board agreed without even holding a formal vote. The money saved went to developing the Studebaker Lark Compact, the company's last desperate gamble. The Packard name was officially terminated in 1958. A brand that had outlasted 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and every other independent luxury car maker in America, died not with a bang, but with a memo. So, what killed Packard? The easy answer is the Studebaker merger. The real answer is a death by 1,000 cuts that started 20 years earlier. The 120 saved Packard's balance sheet in the short term and destroyed its brand in the long term. The failure to develop a modern V8 cost them 6 critical years. Outsourcing body production to Briggs left them vulnerable. The move to Connor Avenue destroyed what was left of their quality reputation, and the Studebaker merger was the final poison pill, swallowed without proper due diligence. But underneath all of that is a deeper story about what happens when a company forgets what it is. Packard was built on the idea that you could charge more if you built something genuinely better. When they started chasing volume, they lost the thing that made people pay the premium. They traded their identity for short-term survival and got neither survival nor identity in the end. The Packard factory on East Grand Boulevard stood empty for decades, becoming one of Detroit's most famous ruins. 3.5 million square feet of reinforced concrete slowly being reclaimed by weather, graffiti artists, and urban explorers. The building that Albert Kahn designed to be the most advanced factory in the world became a symbol of industrial decline. A Banksy mural appeared inside in 2010 and later sold for $137,000. The bridge across Grand Boulevard, which once carried completed car bodies along the assembly line, collapsed in 2019 after an ice storm. By late 2024, most of the complex had finally been demolished, with only 2 historic facades preserved. Today, surviving Packards are museum pieces. America's Packard Museum in Dayton, Ohio, displays over 50 cars in a restored Art Deco showroom. The Packard Club, founded in 1953, still holds national meets. And in 2019, a luxury watchmaker named Scott Andrews bought the rights to the Packard name, along with 135,000 original blueprints. He's talked about building reproduction Packard Victorias. Whether that happens remains to be seen. The thing that sticks with me about Packard is the slogan, "Ask the man who owns one." It only works when ownership means something. When a Packard was a Packard and nothing else, that sentence carried weight. When a Packard was also a $900 car your neighbor drove to work, the question lost its power. They didn't just dilute the product, they diluted the answer. And there you have it. Packard, the company that could build anything from race cars to aircraft engines to the finest automobiles in the world, but couldn't figure out how to sell itself without selling itself out. If you've ever seen one in person, you know what was lost. Drop it in the comments, and if you made it this far, subscribe. We do this every week,